Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. The Book of Mormon purports to be a story of Native Americans. If that's true, should we find more Native American stories in and outside of the Book of Mormon? Dr. Thomas Murphy of Edmonds College asked that question, and we'll find out more about why we don't learn more about Indian stories when we talk about Book of Mormon stories. Check out our conversation.
And so I'm still very happy with the article we ended up with. We did some major rewrites, but it's a different article than we had intended to write. And what we do is we summarize. We put a lot of time into describing what the DNA essay says. And kind of my thinking was people could read the DNA essay. They didn't need me to tell them what it said. But that's what they wanted. They wanted, kind of a summary of what the DNA essay said, and then they wanted what are the strengths of the DNA essay and what are the weaknesses of the DNA essay. And so I think our original version was a little more outside of the tenor and the approach of the rest of the articles. So they brought us more into line. And I think in the end, it's a pretty good article. I'm satisfied with it. I'm proud to have my name on it.
Are you going to keep your first draft and publish it somewhere else?
We've talked about that, and we might do that.
Yeah, I think you should.
I've got a few I've accepted a lot of invitations to write. Once I started getting back into Mormon studies, it's just been invitation after invitation after invitation to write for anthologies and journals. And so I've got a long list to do before I can get back to that. But anyway, we summarized the DNA essay. And, to the credit of the church, the DNA essay acknowledges basically that research that I surveyed back in 2001, 2002, plus some, more up-to-date stuff. They summarize that and acknowledge that the evidence clearly shows that the ancestors of American Indians are coming from North and East Asia, or that's where the closest affinities are between native DNA and the DNA from the Old World. So they acknowledge basically that what I got in trouble for saying, they say it, the church says it. And so that's why I think maybe people maybe some of the pressure my stake president was feeling is that people higher up kind of knew this was coming. Maybe they were aware of some of this research, or maybe they were talking to people that were aware of it. So they, vindicate, if you will, my earlier article.
Well, it's interesting because let me make sure that we're clear on this. So you think that your stake president got pressure to go after you, and then the leaders took that pressure off of him? Is that
he never acknowledged pressure to go after me. He only acknowledged pressure
to back off.
The back off, yeah. Well, and not so much pressure to back off as an emphasis that it was his decision, and so I think in saying it's his decision, I think there was an opening for him to make the decision to not proceed.
Okay. Because Simon was after you, right? And he still got excommunicated for basically the same thing, right?
Yeah, well, they used other reasons.
Well, because Simon mentioned that they used other reasons. But, I mean, he also says those other reasons really wouldn't have mattered. The real reason was for the DNA.
Yeah, and I suspect so.
Losing the Lost Tribe.
Yeah, that maybe is the vagaries of local leadership, maybe the decision making, I mean, I do think somebody sent him the article, right? So, and he never told me who sent it. He did say that it wasn't somebody at BYU, but he never told me who sent it. I mean, there was that Strengthening Church Members Committee, obviously.
You're talking about your stake president when you say he.
Yeah. The obvious suspect would be the Strengthening Church Members Committee, but he never acknowledged that. But anyway, the church's essay basically says that I was right. And
So that's the strength of the essay.
Yeah. Well, maybe it's a biased perspective, feeling vindicated myself. Okay. But so that's a major strength, is that they acknowledge that the DNA evidence that exists, and that DNA evidence provides no support for the Book of Mormon. And the other strengths is that in one of the, I think it's the first or second paragraph, but right at the very beginning anyway, they say basically the Book of Mormon is more spiritual than historical. That's where the church is going to end up, right? I wish they had gone deeper with that, but the evidence is just so compelling that that's the only sustainable position for the church to take, is that the Book of Mormon is scripture, not history, right? But they didn't quite go that far. Okay, they acknowledge that it's more spiritual than historical. It's not historical at all. Okay, they could have said that, but they don't go that far. And then the other thing that I really liked, and I'm sure this is partly Hugo's influence, is that they're quite critical of, they don't name them, but they're very critical of the Heartland hypothesis folks. They're very critical of Meldrum. What is it?
Rodney Meldrum, yeah. I want to get Rodney on. We'll have to get his rebuttal to this, but yeah, that's interesting.
It says, not defenders and critics of the Book of Mormon are making too much of the DNA evidence, right? That's what they say, is that there's no, the science is inconclusive, they say, the essay says, and it's critical of both the defenders of the Book of Mormon and the critics of the Book of Mormon. So I think that criticism of Meldrum is appropriate, because Meldrum is not coming from a scientific perspective at all. He's coming from a creationist perspective. So he doesn't even believe the world is that old, right? He doesn't think people were around 30,000 years ago when DNA evidence suggests that Native people are separating from their Asian relatives. He thinks it more in terms of a very limited time frame. And Meldrum distorts the X lineage of mitochondrial DNA, and really, basically, there's a branch of the X lineage called X2A that is unique to Native Americans, and this X lineage. There are other branches of X lineage that are found in Europe, in Asia, and in Africa. And Meldrum keys in on that and calls it European DNA or Middle Eastern DNA. Well, yeah, it is found in the Middle East, but it's also found in Europe. It's also found in Asia. It's also African. You could call it African DNA. But that doesn't help his story, right?
Well, that would help with the Black Lamanites, right?
Yeah, right. And so he tries to present these other branches of the X lineage as somehow evidence that there were people of Middle Eastern ancestry or ancient Near East ancestry in the Americas. That's not what the DNA evidence shows. That those are separate lineages that never came to the Americas. The only lineage that came to the Americas is the X2A. And it is X2A, separated, if I remember the dates right, about 40,000 years ago, if I remember right.
Which is a little earlier than Lehi, right?
Yeah. Way, way earlier, right? and we actually kind of know roughly where that happened, probably up in North Central Asia. And so this separation of the ancestors of American Indians from the ancestors of other parts of the world. And so because he keys in on this misinterpretation of X2A, I think that's why the church essay is so critical, because it's not consistent with the science. And Hugo is very, he's published on this. This is this is his baby. His work is on X2A. And so, he's an expert in that area. So, of course, he's going to be critical of the people that are misrepresenting his science, the science that he's done. Other scientists have done it as well. But, Hugo's work is well respected and not in the pseudoscience that we see coming from Meldrum. So the Church Essay's criticism of that, I think, is one of its great strengths. It has some weaknesses, though, too. So when I was growing up, the way that the Book of Mormon was taught to me was that it was about all of the Americas, right? That Lamanites were all the way from the Yukon to the Tierra del Fuego in Chile and South America, and even included Polynesians. That's the story I grew up with.
The hemispheric model you're talking about, that the Panama is the narrow neck of land essentially, and then Lamanites just went both directions.
Yeah, that's the story I grew up with. Well, this essay rejects that outright. And of course, that's what I had done in my article, is shown that it's impossible. And so that hemispheric model has got to go, right? Even though it's what we were taught, there's absolutely no possible way that could be an explanation of American Indian ancestry that has any basis in fact. Okay. And so on the positive note, the church has rejected that hemispheric model in this essay. On the more negative note, they seem to have embraced a limited geography, rather than just go with that first statement that it's spiritual rather than historical. That's where they should go. But instead, they kind of, it occurred in a little region. Well, there are just as many problems with a limited geography model as there are with the hemispheric model. And so the problems with that limited model that's not what the Book of Mormon describes. And you can find some evidence for it in the Book of Mormon. Distances traveled is one of those examples. That the distances traveled in the Book of Mormon are impossible if it's a hemispheric model. Also, the population growth in the Book of Mormon, if it's a hemispheric model with no mixing of an indigenous population, it's impossible. Okay, so those are kind of the internal evidences from the Book of Mormon for a limited geography. But the contradictory evidence from the Book of Mormon is that there are explicit passages saying that this is, the Jaredites came into land where never man hath been. There are passages where Lehi and his family are promised that others will not molest them. There will not be other people here. There's no explicit reference to an ethnic group that comes from anywhere but the ancient Near East. So there are different ethnic groups. There's the Mulekites, the Jaredites, and the Lehites, but all of them come from Israel. And there's no explicit reference at all to anybody from anywhere else. Okay, and so that becomes a very serious problem for the limited geography.
Well, let me ask you this, because if you look at the Bible, so I'll just play devil's advocate a little bit here. You look at the Bible, you would never know of anybody, of any parts of the world other than Israel. I mean, doesn't the Bible focus on it? I mean, you've got Egypt, you've got Assyria, right, and that sort of thing. But you don't have anything really about China. You don't have anything about India. You don't have anything about Russia. Couldn't you just say that the Bible is very ethnocentric, and that the Book of Mormon is very ethnocentric, and that we're God's chosen people, and so we're only going to talk about ourselves? If you read the Bible, there's no such thing as a Russian. There's no such thing as an Indian. There's no such thing as a Chinese person. So couldn't you make that argument?
I would agree that the Bible is ethnocentric, okay? That both the Book of Mormon and the Bible are ethnocentric. But I think there's a vast difference between what we see in the Bible and what we see in the Book of Mormon. If the Bible was only about Israelites and Canaanites, and that's it, then that would be comparable to the Book of Mormon, okay? But instead, there are plenty of other ethnic groups, the Persians, Egyptians, Babylonians. There are plenty of other ethnic groups that are known to history that are mentioned in the Bible. And, by you referencing my work in Mayan communities, another comparison you can use or contrast you can use for the Book of Mormon is the Popol Vuh. And so the Popol Vuh is also ethnocentric. It's presenting a particular Mayan lineage and their history of ancient Mesoamerica. But there are lots of other ethnic groups mentioned. It's establishing their story in relationship to these other people. Okay.
Well, but even with the Bible, Israel is like really big. It's the center, and couldn't you argue that the Nephites and the Lamanites were the center of the Book of Mormon?
They were the center, yeah, but there is no periphery. That's what I'm saying. There's no periphery, but there's a periphery in the Popol Vuh. There's a periphery in the Bible. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And so that becomes a particular challenge for the limited geography. And there are some vague references that maybe perhaps could be interpreted as an outside group, but they're not explicit. They're not in any way comparable to the Popol Vuh or the Bible. And so that's one of the criticisms that I advance of the essay, is that it doesn't really, it's not true to the Book of Mormon, which is ironic, right? The essay, the interpretation.
You're saying the limited geography theory is not true to the Book of Mormon?
Correct. Okay. And the essay is not true to the Book of Mormon because of its adoption of the limited geography. And I think the Book of Mormon is a more complex text than presented there. And, to me, the best explanation for that is that it was written by not much more than a teenager, right? Farm boy with limited experience and limited geographic knowledge, trying to make sense out of the world as he knew it. And so, of course, it doesn't match up with the real world. And so I think seeing it at his own introspective effort to understand the world and to understand his experience in this new world as he perceived it anyway, and the old world that the Bible was there, and he was trying to make the Bible relevant to here. And just on a tangent, okay, for you, another tangent.
You're in the right place.
The Mormons were not the first to suggest that Jesus was in the Americas, okay? So that's a Haudenosaunee tradition. But it's told very differently in Haudenosaunee tradition. Because it's not Jesus in the Americas, it was the Peacemaker, the kind of cultural hero, even taking on kind of Messianic characteristics.
Well, and I know in the 70s when I grew up, they talked about Quetzalcoatl was Jesus.
Well, that's another.
You don't hear that anymore, but I know in the 70s I heard that a lot.
Yeah, and I've done some work on that too. So, but here with the Haudenosaunee, right, in Joseph Smith's neighborhood, the stories are that the Peacemaker went after he had helped found the League of the Haudenosaunee and he'd been a teacher among the Haudenosaunee people and had introduced ceremonies and clan systems and basically a democratic form of government and female land ownership, definitely not a patriarchal system, and a system that gave women the vote. Men held elected office, but they were they had to be elected by the clan mothers, and the clan mothers had veto power over their decisions, and they could remove them from office. They could impeach them and remove them from office. And so the Peacemaker set up this system among the Haudenosaunee. And after he did that, he went across the sea, walked across the sea in some of the stories, walking on water. And in others, he took a stone canoe, or sometimes he did both. And he travels to the lands of the Bible, right? And there he presents a message of peace as well. And and presents his teachings and of how to maintain a harmonious society. And the people there rejected him. In fact, they killed him. And he came back then to Turtle Island, or the land of the Haudenosaunee. And he came back to Turtle Island, walked back across the sea, or took this stone canoe. And he comes back and tells them the story of visiting. And he says, those people just weren't ready for me. They weren't ready for my message. And they killed me. You can even see the wounds in my side. You can, see the wounds in my side. Look at my hands and my feet. You can see these wounds. It sounds a little bit like that third Nephi, right? Mm-hmm. And so this story is a common Haudenosaunee oral tradition that existed before Joseph Smith wrote the Book of Mormon. And so what I see going on there is that Joseph Smith must have heard some of these stories. And in my book that I'm working on, I look at some possible sources for that, who he would have known that conveyed those stories. But I think he heard it through oral tradition. And then presents a different version. In this version, it's Jesus coming to the Americas instead of the Peacemaker coming to the biblical world. And so that's a little aside, some of my future work. Let me go back to the essay, the essay here. So my other criticisms, and I shouldn't say mine because Angelo is the co-author of this. And, Angelo had done this great work on looking at Hill Cumorah pageant and stuff that was part of his film that I helped him with. And, looking at the way that Mormons basically dress up in red face and pretend to be Lamanites and Nephites and engage in these dramatic dramas like the Hill Cumorah pageant, and tell the settler story of the Book of Mormon, not the indigenous side of it. And so a big criticism of the essay is that it ignores indigenous perspectives. And if the Book of Mormon really is a history of American Indian peoples, then why don't we host academic conferences together with indigenous scholars and let them tell their side of the story, and we share the Nephite side of the story? We don't do that, right? We don't do that because, there are big problems with it. It's not, there are the Haudenosaunee traditions, they may have some elements of history to them, but the Book of Mormon is so far removed, it's so distorted, those stories, that it's not recognizable to many people anyway. And it's certainly not something that Mormons are comfortable letting indigenous people tell their own story. Mormons want to control the narrative about ancient America. And the reason they want to control the narrative is because they're uneasy with the real history.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Thomas Murphy. In our next conversation, we're going to talk about whether or not it's possible to lose DNA from Native American populations.
The essay, on one sense, blames American Indians for an ancient genocide of the Nephites that may have eliminated DNA. It also acknowledges a 16th and 17th century annihilation of most of Native Americans. Now, notice the timing of that 16th and 17th century. Why is that important?
For those of you who are interested in the entire interview uncut without any interruptions, sign up at patreon.com/gospeltangents and you can hear the entire interview for just $5 a month. Also, we have other tiers. If you'd like to subscribe on our website at gospeltangents.com, click on the yellow subscribe button and you can subscribe for $10. You can also do that on Patreon. and get a PDF transcript. We've also got some other ones for $15 and $20 if you'd like to get those as well. If you're interested in individual transcripts, go to Amazon.com and do a search for Gospel Tangents interview, and you can see our past interviews there in paperback form. So just check out Gospel Tangents. We're always updating those. For the latest updates on Facebook, go to facebook.com/gospeltangents, and you can see our latest updates there. We're also on Twitter at Gospel Tangents. Of course, you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts at tinyurl.com/gospeltangents. And please give us a 5-star rating for those of you who listen to audio only. So once again, thanks for listening. Click here to subscribe, here for a transcript, and over here we've got some more of our great videos. Thanks again.